Imagine climbing into a fighter plane before sunrise. There is no pressurized cabin, no climate control, no padded ergonomic seat, no bathroom, no radio headset designed to isolate you from the engine, and no guarantee that the machine beneath you will still be flying 10 minutes from now. Instead, there is a wooden airframe, fabric stretched over its wings, a roaring engine inches away, oil spraying into the slipstream, cold air rushing around the cockpit, and a belt holding you inside a machine that was never designed to make human beings comfortable. Now imagine that you already have an upset stomach. Maybe the food from breakfast was bad. Maybe the water wasn't clean. Maybe you haven't slept. Maybe you've been awake for hours listening to artillery. Maybe your stomach is reacting to fear. And maybe, before the aircraft even leaves the ground, you already know exactly what could happen next. Because there is one problem no pilot wants to have at several thousand feet. You can't simply pull over. You can't open a door. You can't call a restroom. And you certainly can't tell the enemy that you need 5 minutes. You are trapped in the sky. And that is where one of the strangest realities of World War I begins. The fighter pilot's body was being pushed to its limits by a machine that was barely capable of keeping itself in the air. The airplanes of the First World War were technological miracles, but they were also crude, violent, uncomfortable machines. And sometimes the greatest threat to the pilot wasn't the enemy, it was his own stomach. The myth behind the title. The title sounds ridiculous. How could a fighter plane give somebody diarrhea? The answer is that the airplane itself wasn't usually the direct cause. There was no hidden switch in a Sopwith Camel that suddenly attacked the digestive system. No machine gun was responsible. No propeller mechanism caused an intestinal infection. Instead, early military aviation brought together almost every condition capable of making a human body miserable. Fear, cold, exhaustion, vibration, dehydration, poor sleep, irregular meals, contaminated water, unsanitary field conditions, and infectious gastrointestinal disease. Put all of those together, then place a young man inside an open cockpit thousands of feet above the ground, and you have a very different picture of the glamorous World War I flying ace. The medical records of the period show that diarrhea and dysentery were serious military problems. The American Expeditionary Forces experienced significant outbreaks of diarrheal disease in France during 1918. One official U.S. Army medical history described an epidemic following the fighting around Château-Thierry in which as many as 70% of some troops were reportedly affected to some degree. The causes were not mysterious: polluted water, poor sanitation, improper waste disposal, flies, food contamination, battlefield conditions, and the brutal reality that soldiers sometimes had no practical way to maintain proper hygiene during combat. The important point is this: the fighter pilot wasn't living in a separate medical universe. He was still a soldier. He still ate military food. He still drank military water. He still lived around military camps and airfields. And he still carried a human digestive system into an environment where the consequences of illness could become much more dangerous. Because on the ground, diarrhea was miserable. In the cockpit, it could become a crisis. Before the fighter pilot ever took off. To understand the problem, we have to start before the aircraft. A typical World War I pilot didn't wake up in a modern hotel room overlooking a runway. He might have been living near an improvised airfield. The facilities could be basic. The roads could be muddy. The weather could be terrible. The food could be repetitive, and sanitation was an enormous military challenge. The First World War involved millions of men packed into enormous armies. Every army needed food. Every army needed water. Every army produced enormous amounts of waste. And every army had to move through landscapes transformed by artillery, trenches, destroyed buildings, dead animals, mud, and human remains. The medical science of the era understood many of the dangers. But knowing what caused disease and preventing it under battlefield conditions were two very different things. The U.S. Army's medical history emphasized that digestive diseases could spread through infected food and water and through insects such as flies. That matters because the battlefield wasn't a clean laboratory. It was an ecosystem of contamination. Food could become contaminated. Water sources could become polluted. Human waste could attract flies. And flies could move contamination directly toward food. A pilot might therefore climb into an aircraft with a digestive problem that had absolutely nothing to do with aviation. But once airborne, the airplane changed the consequences. The open cockpit. Now picture the cockpit. There is no windshield surrounding you like the cockpit of a modern fighter. There is an opening in the aircraft. Wind hits your face. Your goggles protect your eyes. A leather flying helmet covers your head. A scarf protects your neck. Your clothing is designed primarily to keep you alive in freezing air rather than to make you comfortable. And the engine is screaming directly in front of you. This was early aviation. A fighter aircraft wasn't a comfortable transportation system. It was an exposed platform attached to a powerful engine. The famous Sopwith Camel, for example, was highly maneuverable but notoriously sensitive. The RAF Museum notes that the Camel's controls were sensitive and that mistakes could have disastrous consequences. Its design put the pilot, engine, and armament toward the front, producing a forward center of gravity. The aircraft could turn aggressively, but it could also punish mistakes. Imagine having stomach cramps inside that machine. You can't simply relax. You can't stop. You can't take your hands away for long. You must control the aircraft. You must watch the sky. You must search for enemy aircraft. You must manage your engine. You must maintain formation. And if combat begins, you may suddenly be throwing the airplane through violent maneuvers. That is when a minor stomach problem becomes something much more serious. The human body was never designed for this. The human body evolved on the ground. World War I aviation placed it in an environment that had never existed before. Reduced atmospheric pressure, strong wind, engine vibration, noise, acceleration, deceleration, fear, and sustained concentration. Even at altitudes that would seem modest by modern aviation standards, conditions were different from those at ground level. The pilot's clothing was heavy. His goggles could fog. His hands could become cold. His face could be exposed to freezing wind. The engine could fill the surrounding environment with fumes and noise. And the cockpit offered almost no privacy. This created a bizarre contradiction. The pilot was simultaneously one of the most glamorous figures of the war and one of the least comfortable. The public saw the scarf, the goggles, the leather helmet, the aircraft, the daring. But inside the cockpit was a young human being dealing with temperature, exhaustion, fear, vibration, and an extremely primitive flying environment. And the digestive system was not immune. Fear can change the stomach. There is another part of the story that is easy to overlook. Fear. Modern people understand that stress can affect the digestive system. The brain and gut are closely connected. When the body believes it is in danger, it doesn't prioritize digestion. The nervous system changes. Heart rate rises. Blood flow is redirected. Muscles tense. Adrenaline increases. The body prepares to survive. And for some people, extreme stress can produce nausea, cramps, urgency, or diarrhea. Now place that response inside a fighter cockpit. Imagine being 20 years old. You have limited flight experience. You know enemy aircraft may be hunting you. You know machine gun bullets can rip through the aircraft. You know your engine can fail. You know a mechanical mistake can kill you. You know your aircraft may catch fire. And you know the pilot you're about to attack may be just as desperate to survive as you are. Your nervous system doesn't know this is a historical documentary. It knows only one thing. You might die. That is enough to make any human stomach react. The pilot's breakfast. The next problem was food. Military food during World War I varied enormously depending on location, supply unit, nationality, and circumstances. But the broader military problem was universal. Large armies had to feed enormous numbers of people. Food had to be transported, stored, cooked, distributed, and consumed under conditions that were often anything but sanitary. A pilot might have a meal before flying, but the timing of meals wasn't always ideal. Flying schedules depended on weather, missions, aircraft availability, intelligence, and combat requirements. A pilot could be hungry, or he could eat too much immediately before flying, or he could eat something that didn't agree with him. And if his stomach began protesting afterward, there was no convenient solution. The cockpit had no restroom. There was no emergency landing simply because the pilot felt uncomfortable. The mission came first. The airfield wasn't a modern airport. Modern airports are designed around cleanliness, safety, maintenance, passenger movement, and logistics. A World War I airfield was something else entirely. It could be a rough strip of ground, mud, dust, tents, hangars, fuel, ammunition, mechanics, horses, vehicles, engine exhaust, and hundreds of people moving around the same limited space. Rain could transform the ground into mud. Dry weather could produce dust. The aircraft themselves required constant maintenance, fuel, lubricants, tools, replacement parts. Everything was close together, and the pilot was living inside that environment. The glamorous image of the flying ace hides the ordinary physical reality. He still needed to eat. He still needed to drink. He still needed sleep. He still needed to use a toilet. And his body still needed to recover from illness. When diarrhea became a military problem, diarrhea isn't merely an embarrassing inconvenience. Severe diarrhea can cause dehydration. It can drain energy. It can weaken a person. It can interfere with concentration. And infectious diarrhea can spread rapidly through groups. That made it a military problem. The U.S. Army's World War I medical records documented tens of thousands of admissions for diarrheal diseases among overseas troops between 1917 and 1919. The numbers were far lower than in many previous wars because sanitation had improved dramatically. But lower didn't mean eliminated. In France, the situation could become especially dangerous during major operations. The official medical record describes the 1918 epidemic in brutally practical terms. Troops were fighting. Sanitary systems broke down. Water sources became contaminated. Food preparation was difficult. Flies were everywhere. And thousands of men became sick. The battlefield did not stop simply because the human digestive system had reached its limit. The Chateauguay connection. In the summer of 1918, American troops were heavily engaged in combat in France. The fighting around Chateauguay became part of the larger Allied effort to stop the German offensives and eventually turn the tide of the war. But while soldiers were fighting on the ground, their bodies were fighting another battle. The U.S. Army's medical history recorded a widespread epidemic of diarrhea and dysentery during this period. The report estimated that in some formations as many as 70% of troops were affected to some degree over a period of weeks. That figure is astonishing, but it also needs context. Not every case was equally severe. Many men recovered within days. Many never reached hospitals, and some symptoms that were recorded simply as diarrhea may have had different causes. Still, the scale demonstrates how serious gastrointestinal illness could become during intense operations. And airmen were not magically protected from those conditions. The pilot who couldn't afford to be sick. Imagine the morning of a mission. The pilot wakes up feeling wrong. His stomach is unsettled. He doesn't feel strong. But the aircraft is ready. The mechanics have prepared it. The mission has been planned. The weather window is open. Other pilots are preparing. The squadron needs every aircraft. And the young pilot knows what happens if he says he cannot fly. Maybe someone else takes his place. Maybe the mission changes. Maybe he is considered unreliable. Maybe he simply doesn't want to let his unit down. The psychology of military aviation mattered. The fighter pilot was expected to be courageous. The culture surrounding early aces celebrated aggression and endurance. The ideal pilot didn't appear frightened. He didn't complain. He climbed into the machine. He started the engine. And he flew. That doesn't mean pilots never reported illness. It means the culture of the time placed enormous pressure on men to function under conditions that would be considered unacceptable today. The first few thousand feet, the aircraft rolls forward. The engine roars. The wheels leave the ground. The runway disappears. The pilot climbs. And suddenly the ground is getting smaller. The wind becomes stronger. The temperature drops. The aircraft vibrates. The engine's rhythm becomes part of the pilot's entire sensory world. And then comes the realization. If the stomach problem gets worse now, there is no easy way out. The cockpit isn't a bathroom. The aircraft isn't designed for comfort. The pilot can't simply land whenever he wants. He has to remain alert, because the enemy could appear at any moment. The physical violence of early air combat. Modern fighter pilots experience extraordinary forces. But World War I pilots were dealing with a different kind of physical violence. Their aircraft were light. Their controls could be sensitive. Their structures were relatively fragile. And their flight characteristics could be unpredictable. Aerial combat involved climbing, diving, turning, rolling, and sudden changes in speed. The pilot's body was constantly moving. The aircraft might shake. The engine might vibrate. The wind might slam into the cockpit. And the pilot had to coordinate all of this while watching the sky. Now imagine doing that with abdominal cramps. The human body does not appreciate being thrown around while it is trying to stabilize digestion. And yet that was exactly what early pilots could experience. The guns made everything worse. Then the enemy appears. At first it's only a shape, a dark silhouette against the sky. The pilot turns. The aircraft banks. The stomach turns with it. The engine screams. The pilot pulls the aircraft into position. The other machine turns away. Then the guns fire. The sound is different from the engine. Sharper. More violent. And suddenly the pilot's attention becomes absolute. There is no room for discomfort. No room for fear. No room for the stomach. Only survival. The pilot pulls harder. The aircraft dives. The horizon rotates. The body presses against the harness. The engine continues roaring. And somewhere inside the pilot's body, the digestive system is trying to process what is happening. The body's emergency mode. Under extreme stress, the body prioritizes immediate survival. Digestion becomes less important. Stress hormones change the activity of the gastrointestinal tract. For some people, the result can be nausea. For others, cramps. For others, urgent bowel movements. And for someone already suffering from infectious diarrhea or food-related illness, stress and physical exertion could make the situation dramatically harder to manage. This is why the title of this documentary is technically misleading but historically revealing. The plane didn't need to infect the pilot. The plane only needed to place the pilot in a situation where every existing problem became harder to control. The cockpit turned ordinary illness into a tactical problem. Cold air and the open sky. At altitude, temperature matters. The early fighter cockpit offered almost no protection from the outside environment. The pilot's clothing was essential: leather, wool, heavy layers, goggles, gloves, a helmet, scarves. The iconic appearance of World War I aviators wasn't just fashion. Much of it was survival equipment. The RAF Museum describes the practical purpose of early aviator clothing: protection against wind, oil, and cold. But even with that equipment, the cockpit remained exposed. Cold can increase physical stress. It makes muscles tense. It makes hands harder to control. It increases discomfort. And when a pilot already feels sick, the last thing his body needs is another layer of physical stress. Vibration, the constant torture. The engine was another problem. Early aircraft engines were powerful for their time, but they were not smooth by modern standards. The pilot was sitting extremely close to the engine. The aircraft's structure transmitted vibration. The entire machine could shake. For hours, the pilot's body could be exposed to mechanical vibration. This wasn't simply annoying. It was exhausting. Imagine sitting in a vibrating machine while trying to perform precise movements with your hands and feet. Now imagine doing it while scanning the sky for another aircraft. Now add cold. Now add fear. Now add dehydration. Now add an upset stomach. The pilot's body was being asked to perform a task it had never evolved to perform. The problem of dehydration. Diarrhea can remove significant amounts of water from the body. Flying can make the situation worse. The pilot is exposed to cold air and wind. He is wearing heavy clothing. He is physically tense. He is breathing rapidly during stressful moments. And he may deliberately limit fluid intake. Why? Because there is no bathroom. A pilot who knows his stomach is unstable might be tempted to drink less before flying. That could create a vicious cycle. Less fluid, more dehydration, more weakness, more fatigue, less concentration, and a greater risk of becoming physically impaired during a mission. The pilot's body needed water, but the cockpit offered almost no practical way to manage the consequences of drinking too much. There was no modern aircraft sanitation. Today, aircraft are designed around human biological needs. Long-distance aircraft have bathrooms. Airliners have sealed cabins. Modern military aircraft have systems designed around pilot endurance. World War I fighters were nothing like this. The cockpit was a workstation, a weapons platform, a control position. It wasn't a living space, and certainly wasn't designed for bodily emergencies. The pilot's physical needs were secondary to the mission. That meant an intestinal emergency could become a nightmare. The terrifying question. At some point, a sick pilot might have had to confront the question, can I keep flying? That is the terrifying part. A pilot with diarrhea doesn't necessarily become immediately incapacitated. He might still be able to fly. But what happens if the symptoms intensify? What happens if weakness develops? What happens if dehydration causes dizziness? What happens if cramps become severe during combat? What happens if he needs to land urgently? And what happens if he is hundreds of miles from where he started? The aircraft doesn't care. The engine keeps running. The guns remain loaded. The enemy remains in the sky. The pilot has to keep functioning. The fighter pilot was still a soldier. It is tempting to think of World War I aviators as completely separate from infantrymen. They weren't. They had different missions. They wore different equipment. They operated at altitude. But they depended on the same military system: food, water, medical services, ground crews, transportation, supply lines, and sanitation. When an army suffered an epidemic, the aviation units existed inside the same broader environment. The pilot could become sick because he ate contaminated food just like anyone else. He could drink contaminated water. He could become exhausted. He could develop dysentery. And once airborne, he had fewer options than the man standing on the ground. Why sanitation was so important? The First World War accelerated military sanitation practices. Armies had learned hard lessons from previous conflicts. The U.S. Army medical history shows how much sanitation had improved compared with earlier wars. During the Civil War, diarrhea and dysentery had caused enormous sickness and death. By World War I, medical organization, sanitation, water control, and disease prevention had dramatically improved. But the Western Front remained a brutal environment. The medical system could reduce risk. It could not eliminate the battlefield. And when combat became intense, sanitation could collapse. The official records repeatedly connect diarrheal outbreaks with failures in waste disposal, food preparation, water safety, and flight control. That was the real enemy. Not the aircraft. Not the machine gun. Not the propeller. Contamination. The fly was a tiny enemy. One of the strangest weapons of World War I was something so small that soldiers could kill it with a hand. The fly. Flies thrived around waste. They moved between contaminated material and food. And in crowded military environments, they became part of the disease problem. The U.S. Army medical records specifically described fly breeding and exposure to human excreta as factors in the 1918 diarrhea epidemic. This is important because the image of war often focuses on artillery, tanks, machine guns, aircraft. But disease didn't care about military technology. A microscopic organism could ignore $1 million strategy. A contaminated water source could incapacitate more soldiers than enemy fire. And an infected pilot could become a liability without ever seeing the enemy. The air war was already deadly enough. World War I aviation was extraordinarily dangerous even without illness. Aircraft were still developing. Pilots were learning how to operate them. Engines failed. Structures broke. Weather could become deadly. Navigation was primitive. And combat was unforgiving. The RAF Museum's history of the Sopwith Camel illustrates how dangerous the machine itself could be. The Camel was extraordinarily maneuverable, but its sensitivity also made it dangerous. The museum notes that more Camel pilots were killed in accidents than in combat. That statistic tells us something profound. The pilot didn't need diarrhea to have a bad day. The aircraft itself was already dangerous. But illness added another invisible variable. A pilot could be perfectly trained and still be physically compromised. When the stomach becomes a weapon against you, think about what a fighter pilot needed most: concentration, reaction time, strength, vision, coordination, judgment, endurance. A gastrointestinal illness could undermine every one of these indirectly. Dehydration could weaken the body. Poor nutrition could reduce energy. Repeated bowel movements could destroy sleep. Pain could consume attention. Fear could amplify symptoms. And exhaustion could turn a small error into a fatal one. The aircraft required precision. The human body was becoming the weak link. The romance of the ace. After the war, the fighter pilot became one of the most romanticized figures of the 20th century. The goggles, the scarf, the leather coat, the aircraft, the lone warrior, the ace, the duel in the clouds. The mythology was powerful, but mythology removes unpleasant details. It doesn't show the pilot shivering in an open cockpit. It doesn't show him exhausted. It doesn't show his hands going numb. It doesn't show him dealing with engine oil. It doesn't show the poor sleep. It doesn't show the digestive illness. It doesn't show him wondering whether his stomach will hold together long enough to land. And it certainly doesn't show him climbing into a fighter after spending the previous night sick. But these realities were part of the human experience of the air war. The pilot couldn't just call in sick. Modern aviation is built around medical standards. A pilot who is seriously ill isn't expected to climb into a fighter and fight an enemy. World War I aviation was different. Military aviation was still being invented. The rules were evolving. The technology was evolving. The tactics were evolving. And the understanding of pilot physiology was evolving. Commanders were learning through experience. Doctors were learning through casualties. Pilots were learning through survival. And many of the systems that seem obvious today did not yet exist. The pilot's body was part of the experiment. The strange price of being a pioneer. That's what makes World War I pilots historically fascinating. They weren't merely soldiers. They were pioneers. They were learning what altitude did to the human body. They were learning how long a pilot could remain airborne. They were learning how cold affected concentration. They were learning how fatigue affected combat. They were learning how aircraft design affected human performance. And they were learning all of this while people were shooting at them. Every mission became an experiment. Every accident became a lesson. Every survival story added another piece of knowledge. And sometimes the lesson was painfully ordinary. The human body has limits. The cockpit had no mercy. Picture the cockpit one more time. A wooden frame, fabric wings, metal fittings, a roaring engine, machine guns, a propeller spinning only a short distance away. When, cold, vibration, the pilot's hands gripping controls, his eyes scanning the horizon, and somewhere inside his body, an intestinal problem he cannot escape. There is no modern cockpit warning, no medical monitor, no automatic emergency system, no bathroom, no climate control, no guaranteed radio communication, just the pilot, the machine, and the sky. What if it happened during combat? This is where the story becomes almost absurd. Imagine the pilot suddenly experiences severe abdominal cramps. At exactly the wrong moment, an enemy aircraft is approaching. He can't stop. He can't land immediately. He can't remove his harness. He can't leave the aircraft. He has to maintain control, even if his body is screaming at him. This is one reason why the physical demands of early aviation are easy to underestimate. The pilot wasn't simply sitting in a plane. He was physically operating a machine with his entire body. Hands, feet, eyes, neck, back, core, and brain. Everything had to work. The cost of dehydration. Severe diarrhea can rapidly cause fluid loss. For a pilot, dehydration was especially dangerous because aviation required sustained attention. Imagine trying to judge distance between two moving aircraft while weak and dehydrated. Imagine calculating an interception while exhausted. Imagine tracking an enemy through goggles while your vision and concentration are compromised. And imagine doing all of that while wearing heavy clothing and sitting in freezing wind. Even a relatively mild illness could become dangerous when combined with the physical environment. The medical system was improving. There is an important reason this story isn't simply one of endless suffering. Military medicine was improving. Sanitation was improving. Medical organization was improving. Water purification and food safety were becoming increasingly important. The U.S. Army's World War I experience demonstrated a dramatic improvement in diarrheal disease compared with earlier conflicts. The official medical history recorded 48,202 admissions for diarrheal disease, including gastroenteritis, among the overseas army from April 1917 through December 1919. There were 208 deaths in that category. That was a major improvement compared with earlier wars. The lesson was clear. Sanitation worked, disease prevention worked, and military medicine was beginning to understand that keeping soldiers healthy was itself a weapon. But the front could break the system. The problem was implementation. A medical officer could know exactly what needed to be done. Clean water, proper waste disposal, safe food, fly control, clean cooking equipment. But the front line didn't always cooperate. Artillery could destroy facilities. Troops could move unexpectedly. Units could be exhausted. Roads could be destroyed. Supplies could be delayed. And combat could force soldiers to ignore sanitation. The medical record from the Western Front makes this clear. During major operations, troops sometimes had to prioritize survival and combat over sanitation. The result was predictable. Disease followed. The pilot's invisible battle. This is why the story of diarrhea in World War I aviation isn't really about a funny medical problem. It's about the invisible battles inside a visible war. The enemy aircraft was visible. The machine gun was visible. The artillery shell was visible. Disease wasn't. A contaminated water source looked harmless. A meal looked normal. A fly looked insignificant. A pilot's stomach ache looked temporary. But these small problems could become strategically important, because armies don't fight with weapons alone. They fight with healthy human bodies. The body versus the machine. The World War I fighter aircraft was an incredible machine. Could climb, turn, reconnoiter, and transform the sky into a battlefield. But the aircraft was only as effective as the person controlling it. A perfect machine with a sick pilot was not a perfect weapon. That principle would shape aviation for the next century. Modern military aircraft are designed around human performance. Cockpit ergonomics, pressurization, eating, oxygen, medical monitoring. Anti-G suits, ejection seats, hydration systems. All of these technologies exist because engineers eventually learned one basic lesson. The machine isn't flying by itself. A human being has to survive inside it. The early pilot had no such luxury. The World War I pilot had almost none of these protections. He was exposed to the atmosphere. He was exposed to the weather. He was exposed to vibration. He was exposed to engine fumes. He was exposed to combat. And he was exposed to his own biological limitations. If he became sick, there was nowhere to hide. If he became dehydrated, there was no modern support system. If he needed a bathroom, there was no convenient solution. If he became terrified, he still had to fly. And if he developed diarrhea from infection or food contamination, he still might have to complete the mission. The most human part of the story. Perhaps that's what makes this story so fascinating. History often turns soldiers into symbols. The ace becomes a legend. The aircraft becomes an icon. The battle becomes a date in a textbook. But the people inside those machines remained human. They got cold. They got hungry. They got tired. They got frightened. They got sick. They had headaches. They had stomach problems. They needed sleep. They needed bathrooms. And sometimes they had to ignore all of those needs because the war demanded that they keep going. The price of the open cockpit. The open cockpit was a symbol of early aviation. It looked heroic. It looked romantic. But it was also brutally practical. The pilot needed visibility. The aircraft needed to remain light. Technology had not yet produced the sophisticated enclosed cockpits of later generations. So the pilot sat directly in the environment. The atmosphere itself became part of the aircraft. Wind became a physical force. Cold became a weapon. Rain became an obstacle. Oil became a hazard. And illness became harder to manage. The cockpit didn't protect the pilot from the world. It exposed him to it. Why the title sounds so strange. How World War I fighter planes gave pilots diarrhea. Sounds like a joke. But the reality is darker. The airplane didn't have to cause the disease. It only had to make the consequences worse. The pilot could become sick on the ground. The aircraft then trapped him in the sky. The illness might have started with food or water. But the cockpit added cold, stress, vibration, fear, dehydration, and physical exertion. The result was a uniquely unpleasant problem, and sometimes a dangerous one. The war against invisible enemies. The First World War was a war of industrial technology, machine guns, artillery, poison gas, aircraft, tanks, submarines. But alongside those weapons was another enemy: microbes, disease, contamination. The same armies capable of producing sophisticated aircraft could still struggle to keep drinking water clean. The same pilots who could shoot down enemy aircraft could still become incapacitated by intestinal disease. That contradiction defined the era. Technology was advancing faster than human biology. The lesson of 1918. The 1918 diarrheal outbreaks in France showed how quickly disease could spread when sanitation collapsed. The official medical record connected the epidemic with contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, poor food preparation, and flies. In some areas the scale was enormous, and most cases never reached a hospital. That means the official statistics may not even capture the full burden. A soldier could become sick, recover in place, and never enter the medical system. For aviation units, this meant that the visible record of pilot illness may not tell the complete story. A pilot might simply be recorded as unavailable. He might recover at his quarters. He might fly fewer missions. Or he might be quietly removed from duty. The disease could be real without becoming a dramatic medical case. The pilot's most important piece of equipment. It wasn't the machine gun. It wasn't the goggles. It wasn't the compass. It wasn't the aircraft. It was the pilot's body. And military aviation had to learn how to protect it. The First World War forced armies to confront the human limitations of flight. The pilot needed warmth. He needed food. He needed water. He needed rest. He needed medical care. He needed oxygen at higher altitudes. He needed protection from cold. And he needed a functioning digestive system. Because no matter how advanced the aircraft was, the person inside remained biological. The modern pilot would be horrified. Put a modern military pilot into a World War I cockpit. Take away the enclosed canopy. Remove the environmental controls. Remove modern communications. Remove navigation systems. Remove ejection seats. Remove the sophisticated oxygen equipment. Replace the cockpit with wood, fabric, metal, cables, and instruments. Then give him an engine that vibrates the entire airframe. Now tell him he has to fly into combat. And tell him he has diarrhea. That final detail sounds ridiculous, but it captures the central problem. The aircraft demanded perfection from a body that was never going to be perfect. The pilot could not escape his own body. That was the cruelest part. A mechanical failure could sometimes be fixed. An engine could be repaired. A machine gun could be cleared. A damaged wing could be replaced. But a human body didn't come with spare parts. If the pilot was exhausted, he was exhausted. If he was dehydrated, he was dehydrated. If he was sick, he was sick. And if his stomach decided it was done cooperating, there was very little technology could do. The pilot was locked inside the machine with himself. The difference between heroism and discomfort. We often imagine courage as something dramatic, charging forward, attacking an enemy, flying into gunfire. But sometimes courage was much less glamorous. It was climbing into an aircraft when you were exhausted. It was flying when you were freezing. It was continuing the mission while terrified. It was maintaining control while physically sick. It was returning home, landing, climbing out, and only then allowing your body to collapse. The glamorous image of the fighter ace was built on thousands of moments like these. The last flight. Imagine the final moments of a mission. The enemy is gone. The pilot is descending. The engine is still running. The airfield is getting larger. The aircraft crosses over the field. The wheels touch the ground. The machine rolls. The engine slows. And finally the pilot climbs out. Only now can he stop. Only now can he find water. Only now can he reach medical personnel. Only now can he finally deal with the problem his body has been warning him about for hours. The aircraft did not care. The mission did not care. The sky did not care. But the human body had been keeping score the entire time. The unseen casualty of aviation. World War I aviation produced famous names. Manfred von Richthofen, Eddie Rickenbacker, Albert Ball, George Geinmer, and many others. Their names became attached to victories. Aircraft became symbols. Squadrons became legends. But behind those legends were thousands of pilots who experienced the less glamorous side of flying. Cold, fatigue, illness, fear, mechanical failure, and the constant possibility of death. The history of aviation is often written through machines. But the machines were only half the story. The other half was biological. What really gave them diarrhea? So what actually caused it? Not the propeller. Not the wings. Not the machine guns. And not some mysterious aviation phenomenon. The major causes of military diarrhea included infectious disease, contaminated food and water, poor sanitation, and environmental conditions. Stress and fear could also aggravate gastrointestinal symptoms. And once the pilot was sick, flying could make the situation harder to tolerate. The airplane was the amplifier. It transformed a ground-level medical problem into an airborne emergency. The real enemy was complex. That is why the simplest explanation is also the most misleading. The fighter plane didn't cause diarrhea. The war created the conditions. The battlefield created contamination. Military life created exposure. Stress affected the body. The aircraft added cold, vibration, physical exertion, and confinement. And the pilot had to somehow operate a lethal machine while dealing with all of it. That was the real story, that a machine built before the rulebook. The First World War arrived before modern aviation had finished inventing itself. There were no mature standards for pilot comfort. No century of cockpit design. No modern understanding of human factors. No decades of research into pilot fatigue. Aircraft were being developed faster than the human body could adapt. Pilots became the test subjects. Every flight answered a question. How high can we climb? How fast can we go? How sharply can we turn? How long can the engine run? How much stress can the airframe handle? And perhaps the most important question, how much can the human being inside the aircraft take? The answer was not enough. The answer was eventually learned through experience. Human beings have limits. Pilots cannot fly indefinitely. They cannot ignore dehydration indefinitely. They cannot remain awake indefinitely. They cannot function perfectly while sick. And they cannot separate themselves from the environment around them. The modern cockpit exists partly because aviation learned those lessons. The heated cockpit, the pressurized cockpit, the oxygen system, the ergonomic seat, the sophisticated medical standards. These are not luxuries. They are the result of a century of painful learning. The strangest lesson from the Great War. Perhaps the strangest lesson of all is that the most dangerous problems are not always the dramatic ones. A machine gun burst can kill instantly. Everyone understands that. But diarrhea can quietly weaken a squadron. Contaminated water can incapacitate soldiers. Poor sanitation can create an epidemic. Dehydration can destroy performance. Exhaustion can cause a fatal mistake. And fear can make all of it worse. War is not only about surviving explosions. It is about keeping the human body functioning inside an environment designed to destroy it. The sky was never safe. The fighter pilot climbed into the sky believing the greatest danger would come from another aircraft. But the sky contained other threats. Cold, wind, altitude, engine failure, fire, mechanical breakdown, fatigue, and his own body. Every one of them could end a mission. Every one could become deadly when combined with combat. That was the hidden cost of early air warfare. The legacy. By the end of World War I, aviation had changed dramatically. Aircraft were faster. Tactics were more sophisticated. Pilots were better trained. Air forces were becoming more organized. And military medicine had gained enormous experience. The war had shown that aircraft were not simply machines. They were human-machine systems. The pilot mattered. His health mattered. His endurance mattered. His ability to remain alert mattered. And the environment surrounding him mattered. The lessons would continue into the Second World War and beyond. The human being inside the machine. When you look at a World War I fighter today, it is easy to focus on the engineering, the wooden frame, the fabric, the engine, the machine guns, the elegant shape of the wings. But look more closely. There is a cockpit, and inside that cockpit was a person. A young man wearing heavy clothing, a person breathing cold air, a person gripping controls, a person listening to an engine, a person watching for enemy aircraft, a person who could be terrified, a person who could be exhausted, a person who could be sick, and sometimes, a person who desperately needed a bathroom. That is the part of aviation history that the posters didn't show. The final reality. The First World War fighter aircraft did not literally give pilots diarrhea, but they could turn a simple stomach problem into an extraordinary ordeal. The disease might begin with contaminated food or water. The battlefield might provide the perfect environment for it to spread. Poor sanitation could amplify it. Stress could aggravate the symptoms. Cold and exhaustion could weaken the pilot further. And then the aircraft would take him thousands of feet into the sky. No bathroom. No easy escape. No comfortable seat. No climate control. No medical team waiting beside him. Just a fragile machine, a roaring engine, and an enemy somewhere beyond the clouds. That was the reality behind the glamorous image of the World War I fighter pilot. He wasn't a superhero. He wasn't immune to fear. He wasn't immune to disease. He wasn't immune to exhaustion. He was human. And somehow, humans climbed into those machines anyway. The machine didn't care. The engine continued turning. The propeller continued spinning. The wings continued cutting through the air. The machine guns remained ready. The aircraft continued forward. Whether the pilot felt strong or sick, whether he was calm or terrified, whether his stomach was cooperating or completely betraying him. The machine demanded that he continue, and that may be the most remarkable thing about the early fighter pilot. Not that he could fly, not that he could shoot, not that he could become an ace, but that he could climb into an aircraft that offered almost none of the protections modern pilots take for granted, and still go toward the enemy. The last image. So the next time you see an old photograph of a World War I fighter pilot, don't just look at the goggles. Don't just look at the scarf. Don't just look at the aircraft. Look at the cockpit. Look at how exposed the pilot is. Look at the tiny space surrounding him. Think about the cold, the wind, the vibration, the engine, the fear, the food, the water, the exhaustion, the disease, and the fact that there was no bathroom waiting up there. Because the real story of early aviation wasn't simply about machines learning to fly. It was about human beings learning how much suffering they could endure while flying them. And sometimes that meant fighting an enemy aircraft in the sky, while fighting their own stomach on the inside. The final takeaway. World War I transformed the sky into a battlefield. It also transformed the human body into part of the aviation equation. The airplanes were fragile. The pilots were vulnerable. The technology was primitive. And the medical understanding was still developing. Yet those men climbed into the cockpit. They took off. They fought. They returned. And they helped create the foundation of modern military aviation. The fighter aircraft didn't give them diarrhea. The war gave them the conditions. The cockpit simply made escape impossible. And in the brutal, freezing, vibrating open air of the First World War, even something as ordinary as an upset stomach could become a battle for survival. Because before aviation became comfortable, before fighter cockpits became sealed and climate-controlled, before pilots had sophisticated medical systems and decades of research behind them, there was simply a young man sitting in an open cockpit, thousands of feet above the ground, a roaring engine in front of him, an enemy somewhere in the clouds, and his entire human body, trying desperately to keep up with the machine.